We are dealing with, in 2021, our first central theme is the theme of the ethics of pandemics. And so for the College of Architecture, Arts, and Humanities, the decision was made to have two speakers come in and talk about the ethics of pandemics from the perspective of arts, architecture, and humanities. The topic on today specifically is addressing plagues and their historical significance. So we're very, very happy today to have with us two wonderful speakers who I have actually enjoyed working with and getting prepared for the day. Our first speaker will be Dr. Hunter Gardner of the University of South Carolina. We will hear from Dr. Gardner first, and immediately upon her completion, we will hear from our very own Dr. Carolyn Dunn, who is from Clemson University. And both of them will be addressing various aspects of the plagues and their historical significance. So what I'm going to do is formally introduce Dr. Gardner, and then prior to Dr. Dunn jumping in, we will do a formal introduction of her. Dr. Hunter Gardner joined the Classics program of the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures in 2007, and has since 2008 been an affiliate of Women's and Gender Studies. In 2014, she joined the core faculty, the Comparative Literature program, and teaches regularly for the South Carolina Honors College. In 2013, she was named an inaugural McCausland Fellow by the College of Arts and Sciences as recognition of her outstanding teaching and scholarship. Dr. Gardner's initial research efforts at U of SC, University of South Carolina, were devoted primarily to exploring the relationship between the genre of Latin love elegy and the Augustan historical context from which it emerged. Her monograph, Gendering Time and Augustan Love Elegy, was published by Oxford University Press in 2013. In addition to teaching and publishing in the field of Latin literature, Dr. Gardner regularly teaches and publishes in the area of reception studies. She has co-edited a collection of essays on adaptations of the Odysseus myth in various media. That includes novels, visual arts, and television, Odyssean identities in modern cultures, The Journey Home, and that's in 2014, forthcoming in paperback at some time, probably already done. She also teaches a course on the reception of Greco-Roman antiquity in cinema and popular culture. She has published numerous articles on the topic, including one on Pygmalion figures in 20th century horror films, a recent piece on Neil Marshall's epic thriller Hybrid Centurion, and forthcoming co-edited volume on the persistence of epic tropes in 21st century film and television. Without further ado, we appreciate Dr. Gardner being with us from USC. Please welcome her as she speaks to us.
There we go. Well, first of all, let me say thank you so much, Dr. McCoy, for that kind introduction, and thanks for working with us and putting all this together. Thanks also to the advisory board of the Rutland Institute. I should probably also mention that last year I published a book on pestilence and the body politic in Latin literature, which is why I've been doing these kinds of talks more recently. But that probably wasn't on the older draft of the bio. In any case, I want to begin today with a set of quotes from our earliest references to plague in classical literature to a 2020 quote from Governor Gretchen Whitmer. A wide chronological range, but one that identifies a constant concern that epidemics and pandemics force humans to grapple with. How do we honor the dead when the dead are beyond counting? So first, a quote from Homer describing plague sent by Apollo during what we refer to as Bronze Age Greece. And then Apollo let his arrows fly at the men themselves, and ever did the pyres of the dead burn thick. Then we have Lucretius, a Roman writer describing an outbreak of pestilence in 5th century Athens. Sudden need and also poverty prompted many dreadful measures, for they would lay their own kindred amidst loud lamentations upon piles of wood stolen from another, and would light the funeral fires, often brawling with much bloodshed. Finally, Governor Whitmer on the death counts during the COVID pandemic. Each of these numbers is a person. It's a Michigander who had a story and has a family who can't mourn the way we're used to mourning because they can't get together safely. Homer recognized, as have countless narrators of plague since the Iliad, that pestilence operates to dehumanize, effacing the dignity of the individual who is eventually reckoned beyond counting. I should note, by the way, that my use of the term plague refers to any epidemic disease, mostly unidentified, experienced by the Greeks and Romans, not specifically the bubonic plague caused by Yersinia pestis, which didn't strike the Mediterranean until the 6th century. For the Greek historian Thucydides, an eyewitness to and victim of that same plague experienced by Athens in the 5th century, humans, quote, died like sheep as disease carried off all indiscriminately. The Roman Lucretius, who recounts this plague in Latin hexameters, the same poem quoted in the slide, he depicts bodies piled upon each other in a way that pits the homogenizing force of an epidemic against reminders of what makes those bodies individuals worth commemorating. He shows us mothers, fathers, children, and siblings entangled in death, and ends his poem with this unsettling vision of families fighting over funeral pyres to bury their dead. As Weimar's comments on the death toll from COVID-19 in Michigan suggest, the dehumanizing impact of contagious disease still contributes to the dread that surrounds it. Her statement, echoing the clamor for some kind of recognition among kin in Lucretius's Athens, also reminds us that epidemic and pandemic diseases radically destabilize relationships within the family, as well as those between families and the larger body politic. The words pandemic and epidemic, both terms born from Greek roots, indicate that whether falling upon the people, epi, or experienced by all pan peoples, contagious diseases force us to recognize not only individual bodies, but populations, groups of people. And as such, they raise the question of what precisely unites or divides us as a demos. That is the Greek word for people or citizenry, which, as many of you know, gives us the English word democracy. Contagion was not well understood in antiquity. Ancient writers viewed pestilence as a sign of divine displeasure, while also explaining disease through miasma theory, the notion that corrupt atmospheres were a source of illness. Still, Latin words for contagion, contactus, contagio, and so forth, derived from contingo, meaning to touch, indicates an awareness that disease could be spread through social proximity. Priscilla Wald's work on the contemporary outbreak narrative has demonstrated just what is at stake during the outbreak of a contagious disease. The term outbreak narrative can apply to everything from the non-fictional Hot Zone to AMC's very fictional The Walking Dead. By making evident our physical contact with others, contagion makes visible those social interactions that are most dear and familiar, even as it destroys them. Indeed, perhaps the most emotionally gripping moments of the outbreak narrative emerge from the choices made by kin to abandon a beloved in a bid for self-preservation, or selflessly tend to one and risk infection in the process. These moments in the drama are also built into ancient accounts of pestilence. For example, Thucydides reflects on similar choices faced by the Athenians during the 5th century plague, when citizens, quote, out of a sense of duty, disregarded their own safety and kept visiting friends, even when family members abandoned the succession of dirges for the dead. Lucretius observes of the same disaster that for their loyalty, selfless relatives were rewarded with death. Those who remained nearby died from contagion and exhaustion, which shame compelled them to endure. Those who were, quote, excessively greedy for life and deserted their relatives fared no better. News stories documenting COVID-19 have identified similar conflicts of interest. Often the good of one family member, a child with an immune-compromised condition, must be evaluated in relationship to the well-being of another family member, a sibling whose good health makes them eligible to return to school, were it not for the vulnerable brother or sister at home. Families must also confront questions surrounding the greater good. Should the parents of those children who work as healthcare professionals risk exposure? The US is now doing a fairly consistent job vaccinating its frontline workers, but that is by no means the case throughout the world. As individuals are pulled in different directions based on the choices they must make, a drama of self and other unfolds, widening pre-existing fissures within the body politic. From some perspectives, however, the very ubiquity of pandemic disease offers an opportunity. If all members of a population are equally susceptible to disease, at least from the perspective of the virus or bacterium, then wealth, gender, birth, race, social class, factors that tend to foment discord in the body politic, they're no longer relevant. Thus, the historian Procopius observes of the 6th century CE bubonic plague that finally did strike Constantinople, quote, for as much as people differ with regard to places where they live or habits of daily life or their nature or their interests, or in whatever ways one person differs from another, in the case of this disease alone, the difference mattered not at all. What we've seen with COVID-19 both confirms and challenges the trope of plague as an equal opportunity destroyer. True, no one is exempt based on gender, class, or race. At the same time, the virus poses a greater threat to the elderly and individuals with a wide range of underlying condition. Even more dramatic are the economic conditions, organized by race and ethnicity, often, that encourage the coronavirus to pose a greater threat to minority populations, who often do not have the employment that allows them to work safely from home. Instead of concord and coalescence within the body politic, we are faced with discord and division. Perhaps there's been no clearer symptom of that division and discord than last year's resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement after the killing of George Floyd by a white police officer in Minneapolis, an officer whose trial for second-degree murder has just begun. The concurrence of an uprising against racial injustice with the spread of disease that has crippled economic health is not merely coincidental. To return to the ancient world and shifting things from an Athenian and Greek perspective on disease to the early Roman experience of plague, we turn to Livy. Livy's history of Rome's foundation and development, Ab Urbe Condita, reminds us repeatedly that epidemic diseases striking the Romans caused strife in the body politic, but also forced that body to reconfigure itself, often in healthy ways, as offices were redistributed among social classes. In other words, when leading aristocrats or patricians died, new officials had to be chosen from the lower social orders. New customs were also introduced to remedy the destruction wrought by disease within the city. For instance, Livy describes a lectisternium, a ceremony introduced to remedy a plague in 399 BCE, in which images of various deities are placed on couches and honored throughout the city. This was seen as explicitly promoting social cohesion. And I quote from Livy's history, "All through the city, doors stood wide open. All kinds of foods were laid out for all to enjoy. All comers were welcome, whether known or not. And people even exchanged kind and courteous words with personal enemies. There was a truce to quarreling and litigation." Interestingly, this will be a tactic not recommended now that we have a better understanding of contagion. And it even will perhaps counter some of the quarantine measures that I think Dr. Dunn is going to discuss. In light of the way that epidemic disease could stabilize or destabilize the body politic, it's not surprising that Livy's near contemporaries, the poets Virgil and Ovid, used plague as a way of reflecting on war, in particular civil wars that ushered in the end of the Roman Republic, culminating in the victory of Augustus over Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. Virgil's depiction of cattle plague in Noricum and disease among a beehive in the Georgics, as well as Ovid's account of a mythical pestilence on Aegina in the Metamorphoses, allow both writers to reflect on civic and familial strife, especially the strife among brothers that was deeply embedded in Rome's foundation legend of Romulus and Remus. Internal discord was sought to spread like a disease throughout a population until all discord was resolved in death. So on the one hand, the Greeks and Romans had a very well-developed metaphor of the body politic. As you can see from this engraving, inspired by ancient fables and anecdotes, one of them, in fact, taken from Livy's own histories. We see the body here at war with itself. Frequently, especially for the Romans, the diseased body politic was one experiencing internal discord or full-blown civil war. In the extreme cases, it was often recommended that parts of the body be amputated, as you can see with the decapitation here. But of course, this kind of rhetoric, cut off the offending body parts, does not shed light on the views or perspectives of those body parts in need of excising. On the other hand, we can also get a sense from some ancient Roman sources that a body politic is too racked with disease to be salvageable. The old system is so broken that a new one must replace it. This was how many Roman writers thought of the Augustan Principate, which followed in the wake of those protracted, painful civil wars and brought peace temporarily and at a price. As theorists such as Susan Sontag and René Girard have observed, at its most extreme, plague has an expurgatory power, one that can wipe the slate clean and bring with it an opportunity for rebuilding. Entirely new orders are, however, perhaps more easily imagined than implemented. Both Ovid and Virgil recognized this in their visions of worlds built anew after a pestilence, that is, after a pestilence figured as a metaphor for civil war. Similarly, the 21st century plague narrative that we find ourselves in the process of writing doesn't have to end with utter destruction and dissolution of our past, but can instead rely on newly acquired antibodies, lessons learned about systemic injustices, to help articulate a more resilient body politic. Imperial Rome would continue to suffer a number of outbreaks of contagious disease that forced Romans to reckon with not only the material consequences of death and disease, but also with the ideological and political pressures that disease brought with it. The so-called Antonine Plague could have been smallpox. It's still argued today. But this plague of the late 2nd century CE, for some historians, marked a turning point, ushering in the decline of the Roman Empire in the West. And all this while Rome was being governed by one of its best good emperors, Marcus Aurelius. And here we have a slide of Marcus presiding over a ceremony that it's really called the Banquet of Jupiter, but it's been likened to one of those lectisternia that I mentioned earlier. And here we have a quote attributed to Marcus Aurelius on his deathbed, as he encourages friends and loved ones not to think so much of himself as of the thousands of Romans he was in charge of governing who were dying of plague. Before winding up, I want to revisit Procopius, the Greek historian who wrote under the reign of Justinian and gives us a full, if perhaps exaggerated, account of the bubonic plague in the city of Constantinople. At the time, all customary burial rites were overlooked, for the dead were not carried out escorted by procession in a usual way. But at the same time, those among the population, the demos, who were formerly members of opposing factions, laid aside their mutual enmity, and in common they attended to the burial rites of the dead, and carried with their own hands those who had no connection with themselves and buried them. They laid aside their mutual enmity. Again, we're reminded not only of suffering, but of the reconciliation, if only temporarily, that has the potential to occur under the pressure of a shared communal crisis. At the very least, COVID-19 has taught us that the body politic, whether conceived of as our local community, our state, our nation, our species, Homo sapiens, is only as strong as our weakest members. And we owe it to ourselves as part of that body to reconsider what ideals accessible to all we want to cultivate. While consensus on those ideals is perhaps as fantastical as any entirely new order they might support, plague narratives remind us repeatedly of the value of an individual, despite, or perhaps because of, the ubiquity of death. On this point, Homer, who begins the Iliad with a dehumanizing plague and ends it with the funeral of an individual, may offer a final lesson worth learning. And here I've given you a slide with a painting of Priam returning Hector's body to Hecuba and Andromache, his family, so that they can prepare for the funeral. Troy's walls protected the city from plague that afflicts the Greek camp, but they did not protect its citizens from war. As is well known, though not from Homer's poem, the Greeks impregnate Troy's impregnable walls and with a wooden horse and a nighttime ambush. The funeral that concludes the Iliad is not that of a Greek hero, as one might expect from a poem written by Greeks and focalized largely from the Greek perspective. It is the funeral of Hector, tamer of horses, and Troy's most celebrated warrior, held during a temporary truce. Queen Hecuba's lament for her son takes us back to the pestilence that opened the epic, but her words effectively challenge the dehumanizing force of disease, with the recognition of a human life, a life not exemplary for being Trojan, but for being that of a son, father, husband, and a person who showed compassion for the famously maligned Helen of Troy, former Greek wife of Menelaus. By highlighting what Troy's women found worthy of celebration, I do not mean to suggest that their values should necessarily reflect our own. I am merely suggesting that if we agree that the humanity eroding force of COVID-19, its insouciant piling up of numbers, is worth challenging, we use this opportunity to think through what makes humanity, the individual lives who comprise it, worth fighting for. Something that, if Homer is any indication, is neither defined by nor contained within a wall. Thank you very much. Leave PowerPoint.
Thank you, Dr. Gardner. The one thing, you said a lot of really interesting things, but I found it very interesting when you talked about the shared communal crisis and the impact of shared communal crisis. And that's something that I hope that we can talk a little bit more about before the end of this session. I will encourage everyone who is in attendance, if you have a question, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A, and hopefully we will be able to address it at the end of our session today. We're very fortunate in this particular college to have an internal speaker, Dr. Carolyn Dunn, who is not only with us and will address us, but is quite able and capable of handling and complementing this subject. So let me do a formal introduction of Dr. Dunn. Dr. Carolyn Dunn is a scholar of medieval Europe with a particular focus on women's roles and social networks in late medieval England. Her book, Stolen Women in Medieval England, Rape, Abduction, and Adultery from 1100 to 1500, published by Cambridge in 2012, offers the first comprehensive overview of women's experiences with ravishment, which ranged from forcible rape to consensual elopement and adultery during the English Middle Ages. Professor Dunn's current research explores the lady-in-waiting in medieval England. Examining these highborn serving women reveals the nuances of soft power, social influence, and economic resources wielded by women who lacked official authority within political institutions or patriarchal households. In addition to classes introducing students to the Middle Ages and early British Isles, Dr. Dunn teaches upper-level courses on medieval women, crusades and conquests, aristocratic society, and pre-industrial food. She received the Dean's Award for Teaching Excellence in 2011 and the John B. and Thelma A. Gentry Award for Teaching Excellence in the Humanities in 2019. In 2016, Dr. Dunn co-organized the 5th Annual Kings and Queens Conference, introducing international scholars to Clemson University for the first time that the gathering was held outside of Europe. Dr. Dunn was awarded the 2020 Bonnie Wheeler Fellowship to recognize and advance her scholarship. Let's welcome Dr. Carolyn Dunn.
There we go, unmute, and please shout out at me if you cannot see the slides. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I would also, oops, trying to get my show on, here we go. I would also like to extend my gratitude to Dr. McCoy and other members of the Rutland Institute's Advisory Board and Faculty Committee for the invitation to speak with you. I'm happy to provide for you this evening an overview of the Great Medieval Pandemic of the 1300s. As Dr. McCoy outlined, this is not my specific area of research, but my focuses do overlap chronologically with the disease, and I do regularly teach it in various classes. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how much our current crisis enhances student interest in the subject. Though to be fair, students have always shown a lot of interest in the bubonic plague. Perhaps I'll end up seeing pandemic burnout instead. So throughout this evening's talk, I will be considering the plague's implication for ethics and diversity, as I explain not only what took place, but also reflect on the ethics of how we teach the plague today. The Great Pestilence of the mid-14th century killed almost half of the population. Older textbooks, you may have seen this, say a quarter to a third, but most of the newest research estimates that at least half of the people who lived, worked, loved, fought, struggled, and prayed throughout Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East died as a consequence of the outbreak that occurred in the space of several years. The disease that ravaged 14th century Europe is often called the bubonic plague because of the buboes that emerged. You may have seen this image in textbooks or news media sites like NPR, the BBC, livescience.com, and unfortunately it is totally inaccurate. It's not a representation of the bubonic plague. It's actually trying to demonstrate one of the biblical plagues. But I do have for you one of the rare medieval depictions of the disease. So the overall image as well as the detail circled in yellow that is demonstrating how the bubo emerges at the site of lymph nodes. You see this not only on the fellow in the painting, but the photographs of people suffering from the disease in the 20th century. So the swellings around the lymph nodes as a reaction to the infection of the plague bacterium. So these swellings, these buboes would expand and expand and expand. And usually if they burst without any outside intervention, releasing pus, a totally disgusting thing to imagine, but that's kind of a good thing if you had to be infected by one of these buboes, because then recovery was much more likely. But on the whole, the disease was about 60% fatal. The whole process would have been just so terrifying for people once they learned what was going on, to imagine first getting a fever, chills, or seeing one of these buboes or several of these buboes, knowing that the space of the infection from first sign until death was only about 3 to 4 days. This plague also infected people and continues to infect people pneumonically, by which I mean the kind of ways of spreading disease that we're talking about with COVID-19. So spreading through respiratory droplets, coughing and sneezing. This so-called pneumonic plague would have killed more quickly and was closer to 100% fatal. And there's still some debate about whether it existed in the 14th century or not. Because of the blackish coloring that you can see in this unfortunate man's example, it sometimes appears, and the plague then sometimes becomes known as the Black Death. But the terminology of the pandemic raises ethical questions that are now unfortunately infused with problematic race-based associations between skin color and morality. So since the term Black Death was not used in English until the 18th century, so past the time period that I'm talking about today, I'm trying to avoid using it and instead using the words that people in the 14th century used to talk about it: plague, pestilence, and what they called the Great Mortality. So what caused this disease? Throughout my years of undergraduate and graduate training, there was much debate among scholars. A lot of people hypothesized that it was indeed the Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague that others knew about from late 19th century, earliest 20th century Asia, especially. So there was a huge range of opinions about whether it could be that or other potential diseases or one that is unknown to modern people. But thankfully to scholarship, the diagnosis of Yersinia pestis is now conclusive. Archaeologists, including Hunter Gardner's colleague at South Carolina, have been able to extract DNA from the Yersinia pestis, or DNA that shows it's Yersinia pestis, in the dental pulp from these mass graves. One of the most famous examples is this one in London, and it is known that this is a mass burial site for 14th century plague victims. The same DNA research has been conducted for the 6th century pandemic, the one that Dr. Gardner talked about with her quotes from Procopius. DNA has indeed confirmed that it was the outbreak of Yersinia pestis. So it is a bacterium, not a virus. So that's a big difference from our COVID-19 situation currently. This is where, when I'm talking about the disease to you and to my students, I like to make a plea for an ethical, judicious use of antibiotics in humans and animals today, because we absolutely do not want to return to any kind of bacterial resistance, which we are unfortunately starting to see. And as I talk more about the disease, and I've already told you about the buboes and it killed 50% of the people, I hope you will understand that we want to do everything we can to make antibiotics continue to be quite helpful. So, understanding and teaching the geographic origins and areas of outbreak of plague is another area for ethical concern. This is a very typical map. As you can see, it's taken from the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's problematic for several reasons. First of all, scholars are still updating the map. Archaeology is showing that Poland wasn't relatively unaffected. The written sources had indicated it. The written sources do not mention an outbreak, but the archaeologists are telling us, no, they actually had Yersinia pestis in Poland as well. That's not the only reason why this map is a problem. You can see off to the right, it talks about the disease approaching from Asia, but kind of gives us the idea that maybe a better map would be a global map, not just one that is focusing on Europe. Unfortunately, this particular global map does not include much of Africa beyond the Mediterranean. And we do have new research showing population decline and urban abandonment that indicates the disease may have spread in West Africa. And these could have been demographic changes that might have been quite momentous for that region's latest history. So that research is very new and still ongoing. This global map also gets the wrong place in China as the origin for the 14th century outbreak. So it's down here in southern China, probably influenced by the third major outbreak, the one that I mentioned from the 19th, 20th century, which is believed to have emerged in southern China, but not the 14th century one. The 14th century one, instead of where the red dot is, seems to have emerged where the gold star is located. So in Central Asia, in the borders between modern day China and Kyrgyzstan. I think it's worthy of note to mention that the disease, although endemic there, is also currently in the 21st century endemic in Arizona, Peru, Madagascar, other places. So ethical researchers need to be wary of assigning blame to one specific region, as we've unfortunately seen with our current pandemic. Unfortunately, we do kind of have to assign some blame to these adorable rodents, these wild marmots who are native to this area where the gold star is located. The plague is endemic to them, to the fleas. So the bacterium is in the flea, and then the flea is on the rodent. And when it runs out of a rodent source of blood, the flea then searches for other sources of food. And so it eventually, if there's humans around, it will spread to humans. But the question is, how did the disease then spread from these rodents in Central Asia to the Middle East, the Black Sea, to Europe and beyond? Also, why was it so particularly virulent in the mid-1300s? So when it comes to the spread of the disease, the movement, transmission westwards, there's one quite popular story. It's still told sometimes in textbooks. You definitely see it a lot on the internet. I saw it with all of the studying that we were doing the past few months, talking about COVID and then past pandemics. And they talked about how the Mongols, expanding their empire westwards, were besieging one particular city, which I have marked here by the turquoise star, the city of Kaffa on the Black Sea. And as the Mongols are besieging this city, they are struck with plague, and they realize that they might be able to, because they haven't been successful in tearing down the walls, that they might be able to send their infected plague bodies, the corpses, the people of their soldiers who have died of the disease, sending them on catapults over the walls, and then infecting the people in the city of Kaffa, infecting their air, their water supply. It makes for a very evocative story. It would be great for a film screenplay, but unfortunately it's now dismissed as pure fantasy. However, the Mongols are still important for our understanding of the expansion of the disease out of Central Asia. So the Mongols originated in the East, and over the 13th century are making their way westwards. And in addition to warfare, what they are doing once they have cemented control of many of the cities and regions is they want to actually see peace and prosperity. They want to facilitate trade, because as goods are traded back and forth, as trade expands along the Silk Road, the Mongols make money. So they actually facilitate trade. They change the rules to make it easier for humans to trade along the Silk Road. And this is probably why the disease transfers from the cute marmot to a different species of rodent that does have greater contact with humans, rats that are riding along with grain shipments, whether the shipments are coming by caravan or coming especially by ship. So this is very new research. I'm showing you this screenshot to demonstrate. It's December 2020 when this particular study is published by the woman that I would say is our foremost expert on medieval medical history. Monica Green is arguing that the pestilence now should be extended back to the 13th century, not just to the region where the marmots are, but the actual transmission of Yersinia pestis out of that area and into humans. She finds evidence for it in the capture of the city of Baghdad, the devastation of that city, suspecting that it hit there in 1258, nearly a century before the 14th century pandemic. But this has been ignored by Western scholars until very recently, probably because of a Western bias. People want to know what happened in Italy and what happened in England, and haven't been turning as much to see what happened eastwards outside of Christendom. So I had also raised the question of why this disease was so virulent. And again, this is Monica Green's research and explanation of the research that is informing us that the DNA seems to have changed. So the genetics of the Yersinia pestis bacterium divided into 4 different branches in a pretty short space of time. So a new strain of the disease evolved and was transmitted to the Caucasus. So we have a more virulent strain plus rising trade networks. And the cities, if we're going back to a European focus, the cities especially of Genoa and Venice, Venice is located here on the map and Genoa is not labeled, but it's here. They are burgeoning city populations. They do not have enough farmland to feed their own people. So they are sending ships over to the Caucasus, buying grain, sending the ships back. And so the rats are on the grain ships looking for their free food. But then also, unfortunately, bringing Yersinia pestis. And that is, again, very new research demonstrating the transmission of the disease into the West. Of course, none of this was known to people in 1346, 1347, 1348. The stories of people learning about the disease and reacting to it show some kind of awareness of maybe a protean understanding of contagion, the theory of contagion, but certainly no idea how it works, no concept of invisible to the human eye bacteria. So most writers were focusing instead on a explanation that involved God. So for most Christians, it is God's wrath. God is angry at humankind, and he is therefore sending this disease to strike humans down. One point of evidence that we have for this is talking about going over here with the Scots and the English. So Scotland is here in purple. The Scots took the evidence that the English were infected first as a sign that God was on the side of the Scots and not on the side of the English. So they very optimistically thought that in the midst of their frequent warfare, this is the ideal time to invade the English because God is clearly on our side, not on the side of the English. Let's invade England. And unfortunately, that did not go according to plan, and they were surprised. But if you do look at this map, problematic as it is, you can get the sense that people started to know the disease was coming. You know, maybe they hoped that it would avoid their particular city or region, but it was clearly coming closer as we move further and further westwards. And so people start to wonder what to do about the fact that this disease is coming for them. And they start to talk in terms of what we might call practical ethics, how to live a good life in the face of God's wrath. And so the various reactions that we see described, most notably in the Italian author Boccaccio, is that people either pray in the hopes that praying would keep the disease out of their city, out of their village, or at least out of their own family's house, or people say, well, we're going to die. Let's all have fun before we die. The governments of some regions start to take a little bit more control. They don't want to just leave everything up to God or everything up to chance or to prayer. And so they emerge into a new field of what we might call community care, the ethics of community care. Some of you reading about early pandemics in the midst of coronavirus may have read about the origins of the word quarantine coming from 14th century Italy. And yes, indeed. So cities like Pistoia, they're not using the word quarantine yet in the middle of the 14th century. That's coming a little bit later, a few decades later. But basically, they have that same idea that we are going to protect ourselves from this contagion, even though they don't completely understand how it works. So making rules such as no one is allowed to travel from other cities into Pistoia without the permission of city authorities, that there would be a penalty for anybody who is extending hospitality to strangers, and rules about how when the disease finally does arrive, that there should be no funerals. So shutting down funerals within churches or in the houses of the deceased. Funerals should only be taking place outside, except with exceptions for very close relatives. So these rules change over time with the recognition that the disease is indeed coming, or the disease is indeed here now, and we're trying to cope with the disease. When it arrives, it is very quick and absolutely overwhelming. So a real struggle to keep up with the number of people who are dying at any one point in time, as we have unfortunately seen also in the past year. In terms of caregiving, we obviously have people who need to show up to bury the dead. And for medieval Christians, they also want to have a priest at their deathbed. This is extremely important for their sense of salvation, the idea of a good death. So not just for the funeral, but also for the last rites, the confession of sins, the forgiveness of sins by the priest, the anointing of the body, and a mass being celebrated. So this whole ritual has developed over the medieval centuries, and it is crucial for medieval people's understanding of how to die well and how to go on to heaven after death, usually with the time in purgatory, but ultimately heaven. So the church changes the rules, understanding that so many people are concerned about salvation, and there just are not enough priests to go around because of people dying in such great numbers before priests could arrive. So the church changes the rules, saying that for this period of time, we will allow you to confess to a friend, to a family member, your husband, your sister, anybody is allowed to hear your confession. So you do have your last rites. You can die secure in the knowledge that you have fulfilled your Christian requirement. Another question in terms of ethics is whether the priests actually showed up to perform these last rites, or were they too afraid to come into the houses of the ill and the dying. There's some indication of complaints that some priests did flee, but like most doctors and nurses and essential medical support staff in our hospitals today, most of them do seem to have done their duty. There's evidence of a higher death rate, in fact, among the clerical population, the priestly population, than among the population at large. Just to give you one example, there's a city in the south of France called Montpellier, where there was a friary of 140 Dominican friars. And after the disease, only 7 of them were left. So that's 0.5% of the population of that friary, indicating that many of them had indeed gone out and tried to care for people in their local community. Now, unfortunately, this was not necessarily the case for everybody. And this is echoing a little bit of what Dr. Gardner was saying about the classical world, that there are some friends, neighbors, family members who were seen to be abandoning their own close friends and kin. That terror taking over, that fight or flight is turning into flight for these people. And some evidence, at least, of this disease just being so overwhelming, so terrifying that they're afraid to go near even their closest loved ones, parents and children. And then another unfortunate occurrence of this extremely terrifying disease came out of rumors of how the disease originated and spread. And some people brought about the argument that there were Jews in the communities, so usually on the outskirts of Christian communities, who were corrupting the air or poisoning wells. And as a result, you see evidence of mobs rising up and attacking Jewish communities, massacring Jewish citizens or subjects, confiscating their property, sometimes to the point of actually burning them to death, which is what I have in this particular manuscript illustration. This is taking place in German lands, in the Netherlands, in Spain, in the Baltic Sea area of Poland and Lithuania. Not happening in England because they had been expelled from England in the year 1290. Otherwise, I have no doubt it would have happened in England also. The Pope steps in at this point and actually says that Jews should not be blamed for the disease. He points out that Jews are also dying. Why would they poison their own wells? They wouldn't. They're suffering just as the Christians are. And so he issues an order for the excommunication of any Christian who is found wounding, killing, expelling Jewish members of their community. But the Pope does not have the power to make that go into effect for all of Christendom. So unfortunately, the attacks continued. We have evidence of an anonymous family in Colmar, which is a modern day France on the borders with Germany. This family who seemed to have understood the financial motives for some of these pogroms and hid their jewels, hid their treasures, because they were worried that a mob was going to come for them and steal their things. And ideally, everything would eventually be smoothed over and they would be able to come back to their house and recover those jewels. But that did not happen for reasons that we can suspect, that they were probably killed or exiled. And so these jewels were not discovered until the 1860s. On top of suffering casualties from the disease, medieval Jews therefore suffered greatly from Christian anxieties about their position in their communities. Late medieval Christianity did not value diversity, to say the least. Instead, they had respect for order, hierarchy, conformity. We see this desire for order and hierarchy in class relations after the plague. So allow me to make one final point about ethics that relate to the survivors in the generation or two after the disease. After the outbreaks of the mid-14th century, there was perhaps a potential for a redistribution of resources, maybe a new normal, the phrase that people are using today. There were certain people angling in poems and preachings and other writings about Adam and Eve, and how back in the day when God created humans, he didn't create social classes with hierarchy. Instead, it was just Adam and Eve in the image of man, and they were the ones who worked the land. There's a recognition by medieval people that the plague was killing all social classes. This is also mentioned by Dr. Gardner for the classical era. So kind of this recognition that we are all equally human. So why do we have these artificial categories? That's what medieval people thought, at least. The work of forensic anthropologists, again, like Dr. DeWitt, they now challenge the medieval chroniclers' assertions that the disease killed indiscriminately. Instead, it seems that people who did have pre-existing conditions, including evidence of childhood famine or other stressors, were more likely to succumb. But the medieval perception was the disease killed all, like the kings and queens who are going to end up dead, just like everybody else ends up dead. And so for the working classes of medieval society, they now see the chance to realize a goal of achieving progress through greater equality in the wake of the disease. Demographics are in their favor. There are no longer enough laborers to work the land, not enough blacksmiths to shod horses and so forth. So land is in greater supply, food, material wealth, all in greater supply after half the population has been killed. The working class is therefore in shorter supply. So they ought to command higher wages and more opportunity to buy. But the landed elites wanted to return to the status quo. They wanted to preserve their way of life, pay laborers the same as they had always done, pay the same amount, or sell their wheat for the same prices that they had done before, even though there were now fewer people around wanting to buy their wheat. So we see a generation of social unrest, at least in Western Europe, as peasants and other members of the working classes tried to effect change. In the short term, they were unsuccessful, but there's long-term demographic change as a consequence of the plague and and also recurring outbreaks. It was going to be in their favor. And eventually we do see the end of serfdom and some, not all, aristocratic privileges. So this story that I've told is an old one for the most part. The rebellions and so forth has been known for a long time. But the DNA research that I've informed you about highlights still possible directions in plague research. Our job as humanities scholars is to explore the human condition, past and present, in the hopes of building a better future. Understanding how societies and individuals experienced and reacted to past pandemics offers insight into human connections as well as social ruptures. Our 21st century ethics requires that we extend the conversation beyond Christians of Western Europe, understanding how the disease in the short term and the great mortality in the long term affected diverse social groups, and to teach what occurred in the 14th century with sensitivity and a mind towards inclusivity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dunn. That was absolutely fabulous from both of you. Learned a lot, and we actually have a couple of questions, and I want to be cognizant of the time, so I'll just go right into those questions. The first question, and it's not specified who this is to, so I'll leave it open for either one of you. This question is from Sydney Bertram. And I will also say, anyone else in the audience who has a question, please shoot those questions and type them into the Q&A. Sydney has asked, do you have any recommendations for literature about the impact of the plague in West Africa during this time period? I have read a good bit of literature on epidemic disease during the colonial and imperial period, but I have struggled to find literature about the pre-colonial period.
So I guess that one is for me. And off the top of my head, I do not know the names. I have mainly been getting this information from Monica Green, who is kind of doing her own research, but also bringing together the research of other scholars. And so I know that it is out there, but is extremely limited. But I would start, Monica Green has decided to just open up all of her scholarship. She has a website, and I would start there because she has an article about making the Middle Age or making the Black Death, the bubonic plague, global. So that would be my starting point, even though she's not the one personally going and investigating those records in West Africa.
Very good, thank you. We have another question and a statement. Thank you so much for coming to this webinar and talking to us. And this is, by the way, from Elizabeth Marvin. Elizabeth Marvin. Thank you so much for coming to this webinar and talking to us. Is there any way we can contact you if we have questions in the future?
Sure. I would say just, my email address is pretty well publicized on the USC website. So just email me directly. I'm also on Facebook. So I would love to hear from you.
All right, and yeah, I'm on the Clemson webpage as well, so feel free to send me an email.
Okay. Any other questions that are coming in? I have a question. Do we know, well, let me just ask it like this. Do we know the psyche behind the society's improvement, that is associated with shared communal crisis? Do we know why that happens, or what's kind of behind it?
Well, to speak to it as it existed in the Roman world, so a lot of the plagues that Livy describes, oddly enough, they were described as erupting, they were arising from within. Whereas, the Athenian plague and even the one that hit Constantinople, those were seen as traveling from either Egypt or someplace south. But the Romans had to deal with these plagues that arose from within, and they assumed that perhaps they were doing something to offend the gods, and that the crisis was caused by their behavior. So I think the idea that there was that something they could do to rectify, the social order, instinctively, if not explicitly, guided their efforts to just see this as, it's affecting us all. What can we do to make it a better, stronger body politic, And the religious reasons weren't necessarily exclusive of, miasma theory, like the corrupt air and things like that. But it was, you could never, there was always a moral undertone. And so that prompted questions. How can we correct, our behaviors and how we treat each other? Caroline, you probably have something to say about that as well.
Yeah, so for medieval Christians, they do have their shared commonality of their religious faith, and they are turning to prayer because they believe that this is caused by God. So if they keep praying more, then it might go away. They're hoping it will go away. There's one particular group of individuals who are known as the flagellants because they whip themselves. It's coming from the Latin word for whipping. So they are trying to suffer themselves penitentially, or cause suffering to themselves penitentially in echoing Jesus's suffering. So not just prayer, but actually suffering and going from place to place to encourage others to do the same. So let's all of us together, we're in this as a community. Everybody needs to pray so that God will, turn his attention elsewhere and stop this disease for us. Unfortunately, of course, moving from place to place is going to be spreading the disease rather than stopping it. And the Pope actually shuts the flagellant movement down too, partly for that reason. But it's, this is a communal coming together only for Christians. It's excluding other members of medieval society. Jews who are a minority, and in some parts of Southern Europe, there are also Muslims, and they don't get to interact in the same way.
Thank you both. We have about 5 minutes left, and I have about 2 or 3 more questions, but I'm only going to do one, and it actually is something that a question that came up from listening to both of you. Both of you are active in women's studies and leadership. What, in your opinion, is the notable impact of women in dealing with the plague, in dealing with plagues? And I kind of preface it by saying I recently had a conversation with someone, and I was telling the person that everything about the latest pandemic has not necessarily been negative. you have to search a little hard to find some things, but there are some positive results. So in your studies in women's leadership and women's studies, was there an active, a positive effect that came out of uh, being present in a plague or present in the pandemic?
Well, I'll go first because I don't know if I'll have as much to say. I with most accounts of ancient plague, there's not much recognition of a gender division in terms of how people deal with the dead or deal with the sick. We know that women were primarily they were seen as the mourners and the caretakers of the bodies in general. So that would, of course, expose them perhaps to a little bit more sickness and nitty gritty than men. There are a few incidences of plague that were seen as caused by women. There's one in Republican Rome where Livy says that this plague broke out amongst a bunch of high-ranking aristocrats. Oddly enough, it was a targeted plague. And then they looked back and thought of it as women somehow poisoning these men. So in the end, it wasn't a plague at all, but possibly these conniving women. So I guess, yeah, I'll say that's a great question. I don't, the literature I've looked at doesn't address the improvement of the status of women because of coming through one of these events. But it's also something that I wasn't necessarily looking for exclusively or explicitly. So it would be certainly worth further study.
So for the 14th century, the two things that come to mind is one, the question of whether women died in greater numbers than men. And there's some evidence from the forensic archaeologists that was the case. Possibly because women suffered from iron nutrition deficiencies, lower class women in particular, not the elites, and may have been more susceptible to disease. They may have been starved more in periods of scarcity. There was a great big famine that happened in the early 1300s, and if families have limited resources, evidence suggests that they were more likely to give more food to their sons than to their daughters. So if the daughters survived the famine until the 1340s, they may have then been more likely to die. But this is still something that is playing out in all the uncovering of the burials. In terms of the after effects, there was a great historical hypothesis that the Black Death actually led to a golden age for medieval women, that they were suddenly able to enter into new jobs that they hadn't been able to undertake before, that they deliberately chose to get married later, and that this is the explanation for why the disease doesn't, or the population doesn't just recover, because people are getting married later, which means they're having children later, and that means they're having fewer children overall, and that women were choosing to get married later because they had new economic opportunities after the disease. Unfortunately, nice as it is, that hypothesis has largely, but not totally, been debunked in recent years. One of the best known studies shows that women were entering the workforce, like going and harvesting crops, for example. They were getting paid for that labor where they hadn't been before, but there was not gender equality. So they were basically, men were earning these wages, and women and young boys and old men were earning equivalent wages down here based on their perceived ability to get the job done. So perhaps an inkling of good news for women, but for the most part, not.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to both of you, Dr. Gardner and Dr. Gunn. Of all of the presentations that each of the colleges are having, this is the only college that has two presenters, and both of which were fine presentations. We have our dean to thank for that, as that was part of his request. And so we appreciate you taking the time, both of you taking the time to share your knowledge with us. As last minute announcements, I really do thank all of our attendees for being with us on today. At 6:30 and about 15 minutes, The Rutland Institute for Ethics will be hosting Dr. Dana Bowen Matthew, who is the Dean of the George Washington Law School. She will be our keynote speaker for TIDE Conference, and her address is entitled, Addressing the Ethical Implications of Racial Inequities in American Healthcare. The link for that Zoom meeting can be found on the same page where you found this Zoom link, clemson.edu/ethics/programs on the TIDE Conference page. Please help us continue to improve this conference by completing a feedback survey. Once this meeting ends, the URL for the feedback form will pop up. It should take no more than a few minutes to complete, and we appreciate your feedback so that we can make this better. And lastly, if you would like to keep up with future events that the Rutland Institute for Ethics is hosting, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all at Clemson, all with the at Clemson Ethics. And that's where you'll find us. Thank you again, Dr. Gardner. Thank you again, Dr. Dunn, for, I know a Dr. Gunn, so I've been really trying to not say Gunn. Dr. Dunn, for really improving our understanding of plagues.
Thank you for having
Happy
us.
to be here.
Yeah.
Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
You too. Bye-bye.